this computer.
All right, well, thank you everyone for listening to my talk. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing with Zenodo and Caltech data and integrating Codemeta as part of the GitHub integration. So you're probably already familiar with kind of how the GitHub integration works. But basically, if you're in Zenodo, you can log into your GitHub account, select the repository that you want to preserve, and then as you do releases, it works automatically. So once you set it up, it's really nice because the user doesn't have to come back to your repository. It just continues to work in preserving the software. And the benefit for the users is it automatically mints a DOI and then provides them a badge. So it helps with citation. It gives a nice little badge you can put in your repo. So it's a really nice feature. One of the challenges is around metadata and how we can increase the metadata, because what you get kind of out of the box, this is a Caltech data record, with the GitHub integration is pretty minimal. You only get for an author, the person who set up the integration, which is a reflection of actually who worked on the software. We don't really get any keywords. We don't get any license information. We get a really minimal kind of record that says, here's some software, here's some information that we were able to find on GitHub, but it's not a really rich reflection of the actual software entry. So similarly on Zenodo, when you set up the integration, you get a little bit better. They spend a little bit more time on integration, but it's still pretty minimal. You don't get a full set of authors. You don't get kind of links in. You don't get kind of a licensing. So again, it's pretty minimal. Now there is in Zenodo a way to put a .zenodo.json file in the repo. If that's present, Zenodo says, oh, here's a file that has some metadata in it, and it will populate the record with that metadata. This is not a particularly well documented feature. And so one of the things that I was interested in is, can we take something that's more standard like Codemeta and use that as a seed for filling in for the metadata. And so I first implemented this in Caltech data. So basically I'm pulling in the Codemeta and I'm using it to populate certain fields. So I'm populating the authors, so I now get full authors, affiliations, and ORCIDs. I populate in keywords, and I populate in the license. So when there's a Codemeta file in the GitHub repository, I can pull all this metadata in and I get much more accurate, richer records. And the nice thing about this works for all the releases. So once I get a researcher to put this in at one point in their repository, it then populates all the rest of the records. I've also been able to implement this in a testing mode for Zenodo. So the way that this works is similarly, we get full authors, ORCIDs, and affiliations. We also get more complete keywords. I've done a little bit more mapping in this implementation. So stuff like development status, I map that Codemeta term in as a keyword. I pull some more of the more of the links that are present in some of the Codemeta terms in as related identifiers. I pull in the license. So we're able to get much richer metadata within Zenodo from a standard Codemeta file. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical approaches I use for this. So for the Caltech data implementation, this is my first implementation. That's available as part of the AIMS package, and it uses dataset for harvesting. So basically on a GitHub release, there's a webhook in Caltech data. The record is created and generates a DOI. That's the standard integration. And then basically on a regular schedule, I harvest out all those files and then process through and see if there's a Codemeta file present. If there is, I do the metadata transform, and then I push that updated metadata back into the repository and update the record. So in this setup, it's a separate process that's living entirely outside of the repository system. Because Caltech data is it's similar to Zenodo, but it's its own fork. So there's no good way of doing customizations inside the repository stack. So this is one option. For the Zenodo implementation, I actually added it directly in Zenodo. So it's part of the code base. So it uses the Python convert Codemeta library that I developed. this library uses the Codemeta crosswalk table to basically do the translation between the Codemeta and, in this case, the Zenodo format metadata. There's also a couple of other functions in there, additional things that do some of the more complex mapping. So when it's not a one-to-one term mapping, it'll do, like selecting the appropriate type of related identifier and those types of things. So there's a couple of extra bits of code that do that type of stuff. And there's a pull request up for you can see all the code basically for the Zenodo bit up here. So the way that it works, normal GitHub release, webhook to Zenodo, it creates the record. But then within Zenodo, it makes a call. If it finds a Codemeta file, it makes a call to convert Codemeta, which then takes the Codemeta file, transforms it into a Zenodo format metadata, and then basically integrates it. So this happens, basically it overwrites the default metadata for those fields that are present. If it's not present in the Codemeta file, it'll just use the default from Zenodo. And then it drops that into the record when it's generated. So this is basically a completely integrated process. It's part of kind of how Zenodo, the standard format, processes the GitHub repos and generates those into records. So it's completely implemented. So what are the next steps? Well, there's actually a larger project going on, which is InvenioRDM. And this, if you haven't heard about it, is a customized version of Zenodo. So you'll basically be able to, out of the box, take the code base for Zenodo and easily customize it for your institution and use case. So this is currently in very heavy development. And I've very recently been volunteered to coordinate some software upload improvements. So this is going to include things like the Codemeta integration. It's also going to include some possible additions in terms of metadata fields to the deposit form. So if you have suggestions or want to participate in making improvements that should flow into both Zenodo and other institutional repositories like Caltech Data, please let me know if you want to help out. Thanks.
So we have plenty of time for questions. So if you have questions, please go ahead. Well, we have 3 minutes for questions, so go.
Well, thanks, Tom. I think it's very nice work. Can you elaborate a little bit more on some of these, because you have mentioned that you're working on these next steps for software uploads and this new set of features that you're going to build on the existing code base. Can you elaborate a little bit more on those ideas?
Yeah, so this is partially, it's kind of being driven by some of the software heritage folks. And they're really interested in, the challenge of having better metadata for the software that they're archiving. So the idea is, for software that's kind of submitted, kind of starting the process in Zenodo or in InvenioRDM, how do we increase the metadata in terms of, linking out to the actual repositories, linking out to things about dependencies. So it's still, this is a pretty new development, so it's not completely formed about what types of things will be added. But yeah, the idea is, again, it's very consistent with what this group is interested in terms of how do we improve metadata and description around research software.
Oh, that's great then. Well, I think also there is an opportunity, for example, to reuse some of the tools I presented in a previous presentation, like you extract additional metadata. Of course, I understand that you may not want to push all the things that have been automatically extracted towards a deposit, but maybe you can use this as a seed to actually enhance the amount of metadata that you have. And if you're interested in collaborating in that regard, I'm happy to follow up.
Excellent. That sounds great.
Are there any other questions? Okay, then I'm going to stop recording.